The Russia-Ukraine war, the latest conflict ignited in 2022. But this war really began in 2014, when Russian President Vladimir Putin began his master plan to take over Ukraine by occupying the eastern region of Crimea. Since the conflict started, there has been an estimated 220,000 fatalities, and up to 96,000 in 2023. This war is still going today.
Welcome to the War Zone. Today we're talking about Russia and Ukraine. Joining me now is former British Army Colonel Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. Hamish, thank you so much for your time today. We're going to start topical. We're going to talk about the US House finally confirming that they will send $95 billion to various countries, but $61 billion will go straight to Ukraine in the midst of this war. How critical is this money?
It's absolutely fundamental to how the war is going to shape in future. And not only for the hardware that it promises. I think everybody knows how short of ammunition the Ukrainians are. The Russians are firing 10 shells for every one shell the Ukrainians are firing. But it's also some of the sophisticated weaponry, the long-range missiles, the ATACMS as they're called, but also psychologically. You know, I've got the feeling, speaking to people in Ukraine over the last few weeks and months, that they're feeling a little bit isolated. You know, they don't understand what's happening in the States with the elections and everything else. They don't understand, you know, why everybody's looking to the Middle East. They are trying to hold back the Russian hordes, who everybody who looks at this deeply knows the Russians aren't stopping at Ukraine. And they seem to be on their own. So psychologically, I think it's massive. And also the other key thing is we understand that a lot of this weaponry and ammunition will be on its way to Ukraine like now. So it's not something that's going to happen in a few months' time. They're going to get it very, very soon. And they haven't had anything from the Americans for a long time, so hugely significant.
Well, yeah, I want to get into that because it has been months of deliberations in the House over whether they will send this money, and it hasn't gone through the Senate yet, but it will get approved and Joe Biden will sign it off, and as you said, weapons will start going straight away. But the money that the United States had previously sent Ukraine dried up at the end of last year, so they've had months without any further funding. How dire has the situation been since the end of last year?
Well, I think it's pretty dire. Those people, even if you've been following it peripherally, you will have seen a change in the sort of whole metric and mode of what's happening in Ukraine. You know, this time last year, we were sort of fairly confident that things were on the move. They were getting Western tanks. They were getting, you know, long-range missiles. Morale was good. Yeah, morale over the winter and the early spring has taken a bit of a kicking. And the fact that US, the only superpower, the only people who on their own can turn things around, have been looking elsewhere. I think it's been really, really difficult. So it's time. I mean, we couldn't really wait any longer. So I think it'll have a profound effect.
You know, the judgment on sending the money actually passed the House in a matter of minutes, but it was deliberated. There were a few House members that didn't think that this money should be sent to Ukraine. Now, this is a large amount of money, $61 billion, when the United States has a record federal debt. And they've already sent $75 billion on top of that. What is your kind of message to a United States voter who thinks this is too much money to be sending to another country?
I mean, what one can sympathise to them. The same in this country and other NATO countries. People are sort of questioning why we are spending so much money supporting Ukraine when there's a cost of living crisis, climate change, etc., etc. And I think for the Americans who you can understand feel pretty isolated. You know, they're 3,500 miles that way. You know, even us, Ukraine is 1,000 miles the other way. So we're pretty close. So, you know, I'm amazed how disengaged some people in this country are with the war in Ukraine. So I sympathise slightly with the States, but I think, you know, they are beginning to realise that if they don't send this money now and this weaponry now, it could be US men and women, soldiers, that they're sending fairly soon. And, you know, it doesn't take a lot to look up the history books to see, you know, back in the First World War, that's what happened. It happened in the Second World War. So much better to use your money and influence now to stop this war than getting all in the future. So hopefully that's what the Americans are understanding, and that's why they push the money through.
And we obviously never know how much the UK is going to have to be involved at any point soon if it does, escalate. But if we get into the actual money that's being sent over and wherever it's going, $23 billion of that $61 billion is going towards replenishing US stockpiles. Can you walk me through what exactly that means?
Yeah, absolutely. So an army, the Americans, the Brits, the Australians, whoever, we have our standing army. We have, basically, if we look at something like ammunition, artillery shells, we in the cupboard have, I can't remember the exact figures, but it's about 10 days worth of heavy fighting, thousands and thousands of shells. Now, what has happened over the last 2 and a bit years is that countries like the UK and the US have been emptying their stockpile to give it to Ukraine, because we realise that Ukraine need the ammunition and it's doing nothing sat in our sheds. But over 2.5 years, people are now looking at their ammunition stockpiles and realising, crikey, we are short here. Looking what's happening in Ukraine and thinking there are, depending on how this goes, there are some ways that it could go, which could mean that we will be fighting ourselves. If we've got no ammunition, we're going to be in a difficult place. So replenishing those stocks, and it is expensive. Some of these missiles cost millions of pounds. Even a tank shell is like £1,000. So it's expensive stuff, and also it takes time to make it. When the war started back in February 2022, Britain was only making a few artillery shells a week. I'm sort of being slightly semantic here, but you can't suddenly go to the shop and say, right, I want 100,000 artillery shells. Just doesn't happen. So we've been ramping up to that. So that is about making sure that we have the right amount of ammunition and stocks. Now, when it comes to equipment like tanks and aircraft, that's an even longer lead time. And certainly the Americans have so much of this stuff in stock anyway. They can sort of take fighter jets out of deep preservation. Countries like the UK can't. So that is what it's all about. It's really getting match ready, because the country that doesn't prepare for war usually stumbles into it. And I think there's a feeling, particularly from commentators like me, that the UK government and others are not preparing for the possibility that we might have to fight the Russians in Europe. And although that might not be the most likely outcome, it is possible. And if you look at it from the Kremlin, look at it from Putin, if he looks at us not preparing, not getting our ammunition stocks up, not training our forces, then that emboldens him. And he's emboldened anyway. So it's all about preparation, so that hopefully the more preparation we do, the less likely we're going to have to fight. And the more equipment and ammunition we give to Ukraine, the more likelihood they can hold the Russians.
We're going to get into whether, the UK, Australia, or any NATO country needs to go over and help boots on the ground with Ukrainians. But sticking with the funding that's been sent over, it's obviously a pivotal, next step in this war. They've been waiting for so long. You said the weapons are going to be sent over in days, or now, or by Friday, I think the President said. What are the main weapons that Ukraine is so desperately in need of? Well,
this has become very much a sort of what we call an air defence war, an air war, air power war, an artillery war, and everybody's seen the drones. And there are tens, hundreds of thousands of drones. But I think most especially at the moment is just artillery shells. These are 155 millimetre shells that fire over sort of 15 kilometres and have a high explosive impact. That is what Ukraine has really been suffering, because Russia just seems to have far, far more of it. And it's even ammunition, even the bullets, that an infantryman is carrying. Some of the usage rates of this ammunition is First World War usage rates. Now, when I was still an army planner, we were planning for sort of usage rates that we had in the First and Second Gulf Wars, which are, probably less than 10% of what's been used. So that has been a real realisation there, to make sure that you've got the right amount of kit. The sophisticated weaponry, mentioned the ATACMS long-range precision missiles, the Storm Shadow, very importantly today, Britain has announced another £500 million to Ukraine, but including Storm Shadow. Storm Shadow is this long-range missile that's taking out all the Russian ships, attacking Kerch Bridge and others. So really strategically important weaponry that Ukrainians have very few. They're getting some more now. So those are the sort of key bits and pieces they need. And not forgetting, I've talked about an air war. Air defence is key, and perhaps we'll come back to that.
Yeah.
But the F-16 fighter jets, which have been promised for a long time, are literally coming over the horizon. And they, one doesn't want to use game changer too much, but the F-16s could be hugely significant too.
We can get into the air kind of capabilities because it's a different situation to say Israel and Iran, for instance, that you and I have spoken about, where there's a few countries in the middle of these two countries, whereas obviously Ukraine and Russia border each other. So they've got, the threat of actual boots on the ground and walking over the border, invading the border, and airspace. So how critical is it that Western allies and NATO start helping out Ukraine in deterring Russian drones and missiles?
I think it's absolutely key. And there are two very different conflicts going on at the moment, the Middle East and Ukraine. But quite rightly, President Zelensky said after the sort of US coalition, including Britain, shot down all those Iranian drones and missiles the other day, why on earth aren't you doing that over Ukraine? And I see absolutely no reason why we shouldn't do. There is a concern, and some leading politicians, like our own Foreign Secretary David Cameron, have talked about no NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine. Now, fundamentally, I think that's it's wrong to tell your enemy what you're going to do.
Yeah.
That's the first thing you learn in general school. Try and keep your enemy thinking. If you say you're not going to do something, he can tick that off and think, right, OK, I'm not a concern. So when it comes to the air defence side, I can't see why you haven't got British jets in the Black Sea shooting down drones being fired from Crimea. Similarly, jets in Poland or Romania, because a lot of the missiles they're firing at these hypersonic missiles and drones, travel a long way. So you don't have to be in Ukraine airspace. You don't have to be in Russian airspace. And I think by what was done to Iran is a precedent, and we should follow it. And it's all about saving civilians' lives in the end. That's why the US and the UK and the French and the Jordanians shot down those missiles and drones, because they didn't want to see Israeli civilians killed. Well, most of those drones and missiles, the long-range ones in particular, Russian firing, is at towns and cities where civilians are. And I think it would be fundamental if NATO did help, because one thing that we need to talk about is morale.
Yeah.
And morale has been sapped, not just on the front line of the soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, but the civilian population who have been at war for 2.5 years as well, and have, until the big US aid budget decision, have felt pretty alone.
And so what you're basically saying is that NATO can get involved to help out in the airspace by basically sitting on the sidelines of not in airspace that would, warrant such a threat. You and I have spoken about the Iron Dome and how critical it has been that the US helped fund this for Israel. We can see how protective it has been for Israeli civilians. Is there a world in which we would help fund one for Ukraine, and how quickly could that even be built?
Well, it's again, one has to look at each particular case. Israel in size terms compared to Ukraine is a tiny country.
Yeah.
Population of under 10 million, I believe. Ukraine, much larger population, but a vast country. Now, if you have an Iron Dome, as the Israelis do over Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, you need a certain amount of physical missiles to be able to do it. Across the whole of Ukraine, it's such a bigger requirement. So I think what we are trying to do is to do that, provide them enough air defence, Patriot missiles and other missiles to create an Iron Dome. But we're seeing, because Russia is firing so much, stuff is getting through, which is why, actually, if you take your Iron Dome analogy, if we then included NATO jets, perhaps from outside Ukraine airspace, then that would be more secure. But the other thing to it, which Ukrainians are really suffering, is that they're running out of missiles for their own Iron Dome. So that's why it's so important the American money is coming to refill those stocks. And it's a number game at the end. You know, Russia just seems to have endless missiles, ammunition, endless soldiers they're prepared to throw into it, the meat grinder. And Putin knows his tactic is to outlast Ukraine and outlast the West and NATO.
For the money to dry up.
The money will dry up. People will get bored is the wrong word. But that is the assumption in the UK and probably the US, that Putin will stop at Ukraine if he's successful. I think a lot of us who've lived and breathed this and looked at it very closely don't get that.
No.
I think nobody really thinks Putin will stop. And he keeps saying, you know, he is retaking the old Soviet Union and there are a few more countries to go after Ukraine.
Well, on that note, Hamish, is it safe to say that, you know, Putin really will, he will put every money, every resource into this war for as long as it takes, decades even?
Well, I think decades not. I mean, the old boy's sort of gone 70, so
his followers, perhaps.
Well, yeah, possibly. But I think it is true at the moment that Russia is what we call on a total war footing. So everything in the economy, everything politically is geared to the war in Ukraine. So, you know, tractor factories are being turned into tank factories. The amount of money that they're spending, I think, over 6% of their gross domestic product on defence, but actually also a lot more. And, you know, will it run out? Well, eventually it will. But unfortunately, there's still countries like India and China that are buying Russian oil that are keeping the money going. But the more we isolate them, the more we sanction and prevent them getting some of the high-tech wizardry that they need for their drones. You know, it is a slow strangulation. The trouble is whether the strangulation of the Russian economy is going to be tight and quick enough for the sort of strangulation of Western morale to keep going.
Yeah.
And the Ukrainians, of course, most importantly. At the moment, it's in the balance, I think.
Yeah. Let's get into kind of what's been happening in the last week or so, money aside. What momentum has both Russia and Ukraine made on both sides of their fighting?
Well, I think this spring and early summer has, you know, if you were using a sporting analogy, you know, the Russians, you know, have the advantage and are on the move. You know, I've written and we've discussed quite a lot about the use of CS gas as a prescribed chemical weapon, which is having a profound effect. Because in effect, you've got two massive armies, 600,000 Russians on one side, slightly less Ukrainians on the other, on a trench system that's over 1,000 miles long, which looks very similar to the trenches in the First World War. And movement has been minuscule over the last sort of year or so, as it was in the First World War. But you get something, you know, the first time the Germans had any progress in the First World War, they used chlorine gas. So we then look to Ukraine, they're using CS gas, you know, 1,500 times and a lot in the last 6 months. And they are making small progress, you know, a kilometre here, a kilometre there, but simply because the Ukrainian soldiers don't have gas masks and, you know, a bit of a morale thing. But I think slightly more worrying more recently in the last few days, and in fact, being reported today, the Russians have broken through around Avdiivka and Bakhmut, that people might remember a lot of fighting over last Christmas, and advanced 5 kilometres. Now, 5 kilometres in this sort of warfare is hugely significant. Now, it might rumours that some of the Ukrainian brigades have been exhausted, and that's why that's happened. You know, hopefully they've got some sort of counterattack plan. But Russia is on the front foot at the moment. It seems to have limitless soldiers. I mean, there are prisoners who are now who have been taken out of prison, served 6 months on the front line, gone back to prison for other crimes, and are now back at the front. So Russia has that almost endless supply. They have an endless supply of people from the Far East in Russia, who the politicos and the wealthy in St. Petersburg and Moscow don't know about and don't care about. which is one of the reasons we really don't know the casualty rates,
Yeah.
because it's all honed down. So at the moment, there is a lot of pressure on that Ukrainian front, and it's moving. The Ukrainians had a few successes with some long-range missiles. Another Black Sea Russian ship was destroyed a few days ago. The Black Sea Fleet is non-existent, which is a good thing. But yeah, I think we're approaching a time. The weather is good. It's warming up. The ground's hard. Good for tank maneuver. The Russians might do a really big push very soon, but at least Ukraine's going to get some ammunition and missiles to counter it. So it's balanced.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to ask is, in that area that Ukraine is trying to hold off from Russia from moving further in past that 5 kilometre amount, is it a situation where they're quite literally buying time until they get ammunition and more weapons from the US?
I think it's very challenging on that sort of eastern flank, if you like, that sort of Donbass area, that, people are shattered. We know the Russians are as well, but they have no choice. In a Russian army, you have a second group of people who are, if anybody doesn't want to fight, they're shot. You can't turn around and run away. You can in Ukraine, sort of thing. But I think people are getting exhausted. Lots of the young are sort of questioning, why should I go to the front line? My life expectancy is 5 weeks.
Yeah.
When you're 21, that's a pretty shocking thought. So that's the sort of situation that we've got at the moment. And it is just very basic old-fashioned warfare, which is why we need the sophisticated weaponry from the US and people like ourselves and the jets to have that advantage. Because we've seen in the Iranian attack on Israel, if you have the high-tech stuff, you can win, but you need enough of it and you need to be able to know how to use it. And that is what we're trying to enable Ukraine to do.
Hamish, I want to get into what you were saying before about obviously recruitment and getting more boots on the ground. Is Ukraine in a situation, they've got about 1 million personnel, it says active personnel. Are they in desperate need of more soldiers? And if they are struggling for recruitment on home soil, is there a situation going to be where the US and the UK are going to have to send their own soldiers over to fight on the ground in Ukraine?
We are balanced. It's no secret that Ukraine is struggling for recruits. You've got a lot of people who've been on the front line for a couple of years, hard fighting. It's hard work. The longest continuous battle I ever did was the first Gulf War, which was 8 months. And that was hard yards. You then wind that out. So a lot of their veterans are shattered. Replacing them with recruits is, it's not quite that sort of national survival after the 24th of February 2022, when everybody was right, we're coming back to Ukraine, we'll fight. Now, for the last 12 months, Ukraine's felt isolated and unloved by, ourselves and the Americans. The Ukraine people, as I said, the youngsters know that, it's pretty much a death sentence if they're going to the front line. To keep this all going forward has been a real challenge. So I think recruitment, when we come to NATO boots on the ground, well, ultimately, that might have to happen because it will, there are probably NATO boots on the ground doing advising anyway, and I think people have admitted to that. But actually having British tanks and American infantrymen there, people will be planning for that, because ultimately what one wants to do, you want to defeat your enemy as far away from you as possible. Now, if we didn't consider going into Ukraine, then we'll be fighting them in Poland and Germany, and we've seen how that's happened. So I think we should consider potentially boots on the ground. We certainly shouldn't tell Putin that we're not going to do it, because we need to give him lots of different things to think about, which is why, slight divergence. When Finland and Sweden came into NATO, that was great, because Putin suddenly had to look to the north, where he never had to in the future. We need to overwhelm them with decisions that they have to make, and ultimately overwhelm them with military capability. And if that means going into Ukraine to put boots on the ground to hold the Russians, we definitely must consider that. History would relate that, that if you don't consider those sort of things, it's much more difficult. If Russia gets momentum and starts moving westward, it's very, very difficult to fight an enemy if you're retreating. Much easier if you're on the front foot.
Hamish, we're going to kind of finish on what's next for Russia, Ukraine. We spoke about, obviously, NATO's involvement, if there were to be an involvement, boots on the ground. But if Ukraine were to lose this war, what would the trickle-down effect look like for Western countries?
Well, it's something, it's a great question, but it's something that one doesn't want to answer because they can't lose it. There is the option that Putin will stop. He's got Ukraine, but everything he said does not buy that. He wants the old Soviet Union. He wants Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. He wants Poland. He wants Romania. He wants Bulgaria. Now, those are all ex-Soviet countries. So he sees himself Peter the Great. Peter the Great dominated Europe, and that's what Putin wants to do. And I think now he is so committed to Ukraine. He knows if he fails in Ukraine, he's finished. Yeah. He's like Stalin. It's all over. But unfortunately, he's not that sort of person. So I think that's got to be considered. I think we must, the nuclear issue as well, which everybody is hugely concerned about. And I don't want to sound blasé, but this is Putin's bluff. Only today or yesterday, the Poles said they wanted nuclear weapons on their soil, which actually they did have in the Cold War. So it's not completely new. But people are fixated because virtually every day Putin or one of his gangsters says they're going to nuke London or nuke the West. And that has created timidity in politicians in this country and elsewhere. So I think, oh, crikey, he's going to use nuclear weapons. Let's not do this. And I think we've been slow to provide them kit because of that. Yeah. But actually, Putin knows that the West has as many, if not more, nuclear weapons than he does. And that would be the end. So his dream would disappear. And also saying he'll use tactical small nuclear weapons, again, is a complete chimera. It can't happen because it would take so long for him to set them up. We'd destroy them before he even used them. So I think people should not be overly concerned about the nuclear issue. But they should be concerned that if Russia prevails in Ukraine, we are going to have to fight the Russians in a NATO country because the first Russian boot that goes into Poland or Romania invokes Article 5, and we're all involved. And we need to prevent that. Therefore, we need to hold and defeat the Russians in Ukraine.
That's an interesting point you say about the nuclear weapons, Hamish, because a lot of people would think that Putin's threats to use nukes would start a nuclear war with so many countries involved. So it is interesting to say that it's kind of less of a threat than we think. But I want to finish on just a simple question of how do you think this will end?
Well, it's how I think and how I hope. How I hope it will end is that Ukraine will get the capability, military capability they need. They'll get those fighter jets. NATO will be far more forward-leaning on taking out missiles, and they will hold the Russians and start pushing them back, perhaps take out the Kerch Bridge, retake Crimea, and then with them on the front foot, there is then some sort of negotiation. Now, I know that Zelensky has said, he won't trade anywhere in Ukraine for the Russians. If they retake Crimea, they might have to. So if NATO and the West stays strong, Ukraine will hold the Russians, prevail, and we will get to the right situation. If we show any weakness, Putin, the tyrant that he is, will exploit that weakness. And if he starts moving westwards from Ukraine, we're all involved, and everything else that's vexing us at the moment could become horrifically irrelevant, which is why, the young people I speak to in this country who are not engaged in this and saying they won't fight, unfortunately, in 1913 and also in 1939, those kids of that era were saying the same. We didn't hold Hitler. We didn't hold the Germans in the First World War. We didn't hold Hitler in the Second World War. and we were all in for a world war. That's what we must avoid.
So it really is a replication. It really is a situation currently looking at Putin and his war in Ukraine. We're looking at it like it's a repeat of World War II. And he is Hitler.
Entirely.
Yeah.
Entirely. Absolutely. And one hopes that Putin will disintegrate as Hitler did. But you know, we need to make that happen. It's not going to happen by us just sitting here and, you know, and looking at the situation. We, the British government, the American government, NATO countries, must actively ensure that Ukraine prevails and the modern day Hitler is stopped in his bunker, and we can get a peace back in Europe again.
Hamish, thank you. That's it for us today on The War Zone. Thank you guys for watching, and to Hamish de Bretton-Gordon for his expert analysis.